So you might already know, but yesterday I played against Magnus Carlsen in a simul as part of the opening ceremony of the Sinkfield Cup. I posted a video, which you should definitely check out, of the footage of that game. But in this video, I want to break down the game and share what exactly happened, what was going through my mind, all the funny lines that could have happened, and maybe some missed opportunities as well. And the game began with an English opening, pawn to c4, which was already a small disappointment because if he had played e4, then maybe I would go into a Stafford gambit. Not sure if I would pass up the opportunity to play Stafford against Magnus OTB. But English opening it was, and I decided to play just my main repertoire, pawn e6, going for a Queen's Gambit declined, so a small transposition. But we did transpose into Queen's Gambit, and he played a very topical move, pawn takes pawn, the Queen's Gambit declined exchange variation. And just a few weeks ago, I was studying his games in this line in preparation for some of my tournament games in the Abu Dhabi Masters, specifically his game against Vladimir Kramnik, which goes c6, e3, bishop f5, queen f3, and he won just a positional masterpiece in this variation. So I knew that he's just a pro in this line and a pro in general. But he actually went for a different position after I played pawn c6. He played queen c2. And this just prevents the so-called positional line with bishop f5. And I took a small think here, deciding which line to go for. Because the move I played in the past is knight a6, which is kind of a tricky sideline, going for knight b4 and sometimes g6, bishop f5. But I opted for a different sort of offbeat line, bishop to d6, which is a variation I've been studying recently. And not sure if it has an official name, but I like to dub this the Casa-Corley variation, because International Master Casa-Corley won a bunch of nice games with this line. And normally the bishop doesn't go to d6, usually it goes to e7 to diffuse the pin. But this move leads to a lot of dynamic positions where black can play for more than just equality. So game continued, Magnus plays e3, I castle, bishop d3, pawn h6, hitting the bishop, he retreats, and now rook to e8. And this is all still preparation on my part. And here I knew that there are two basically main moves for white. White can play knight g e2 or knight f3. Knight e2 is a bit more common, after which I would play a5 and then really hope that white castles, and then there would be a Greek gift with knight g4 to follow. And there are some other lines that after a5, white can play h3, and there's knight a6, a3, knight c7. There's a cool maneuver here to bring the knight to g5, and then get a kingside attack, which is featured in some of Casa-Corley's games. But we didn't go quite into this because he opted for knight to f3. And here the plan changes a little bit. I was still prepared for this. I played bishop to e6. The goal is to complete development and get a harmonious setup with minor pieces. And there's a small trap here that if white is a little bit too feisty and goes for knight to e5, then there's a really strong move pawn c5 to just undermine white's setup, play knight c6. And yeah, this is already probably preferable for black. So he didn't play knight e5. I think he took a small think and decided to castle. And then I complete development. And then he plays a3. So this is a very typical move for this structure. White is going for the minority attack to eventually play b4, b5, and try and weaken my queenside structure. So I try and slow this down with pawn a5. He plays rook a b1, and I play queen b8. And this move was essentially the last move of my preparation. I knew that it's a typical square for the queen to get off the diagonal, so basically unpin the knight, and also create the battery aimed at h2. But yeah, with his next move, he diffuses the battery, and I go for pawn to b5, so leaving the tension between the bishops. And b5, it's somewhat of a double-edged move. On one hand, it kind of weakens the c-pawn, because now the c-pawn is backwards on the half-open file. But at the same time, the point of b5 is to get a positional setup with eventually pawn a4, and then maneuvering the knight to c4. And if black can achieve this, then it's actually really nice because b3 would just be restricted. If ever b3, I would take it. And the knight would be like a really nice outpost on the c4 square. So he retreats. I think this is a very fine move, unleashing the queen, hitting the pawn. I trade on g3 and play queen d6. So centralizing the queen, defending the pawn. He doubles up. I defend, knight f4, and now I go for a4. So trying to achieve the dream setup. But then he starts getting some initiative. He starts by taking the bishop. I take back with the queen. I didn't want to take back with the pawn and just leave the king side a bit weaker, especially kind of this g6 square is a gaping hole in the position. So I took with queen, allowing bishop f5, move back, and then he plays knight e5. So I was beginning to feel a little bit nervous here because the pressure is mounting and I'm pinned in various directions. Knight is pinned to the rook. Arguably, this pawn is pinned along the c-file, but the pawn is also just attacked now 3 times by the knight, queen, and rook. So for a moment, I thought black might be collapsing, but I realized it's not so simple for white after my next move, rook to a7, just reinforcing my knight and preparing rook c7. And even though it looks really passive for black, it's not so easy for white to actually crack the position. And here he took another think and played the move queen to c3 with the idea that after I double up my rooks, he plays queen to b4, offering a queen trade. But this is a very Magnus-esque move because he's trying to get just a slightly better endgame with queens off the board where he can grind me down and take advantage of the long-term deficiency in my position. And I didn't really have any other choice. Had to trade queens. He takes back with pawn. And in this position, I took another think. And I thought I had a really clever move in store. I took the knight, leaving the rook hanging. And then I was surprised because he just immediately took back without even taking time to consider bishop takes c8. At least it seemed that way. But I thought that if he takes on c8, this would be a really interesting exchange sacrifice for black, where I would hop into d3, hit the rook, hit the pawn. This bishop is still hanging. And in the event of rook c3, I would take the pawn, allowing the bishop to escape, let's say like bishop f5. And even though I'm down a rook for knight and pawn, I think black has full compensation because the queen side is now really solid. Knight defends a pawn. And the engine actually just gives equality in this position. So that might be why that he went for the other move. Pawn takes knight, declining the extra material, but keeping the pressure. Now I have to move back to d7 to save the rook. And here I'm still feeling the heat because after pawn b3 takes and takes, it's not easy to untangle. Like my knight is completely stuck. My rooks are tied down to the pawn, especially after white will play rook c3. So there's not too many options for black. And I figured I might as well improve my king. I play king to f8. He reinforces the pawn on e5 with pawn f4. So now white's pawns are looking much nicer. I play king e7, rook c3. I kick the bishop. He retreats. And now in this position, I played a move which I'm probably going to regret for the rest of my life. And I'm getting a call right now, but that was not the time, except maybe it is the time. Hello? 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 Okay. Yeah, that was a butt dial. Oh, I got butt dialed in the middle of a video. What was I saying? Oh yeah, in this position, I played a move which I'm probably going to regret for the rest of my life. And I really should have taken the advice of Ben Feingold to never play f6, but I played f6 in this position, thinking that it's a way to just try and simplify and get rid of this really annoying pawn on e5. And when I played this move, my intention was that after he takes back, which he did, I would play king d6 to defend the pawn, essentially over defend the pawn, and then go for rook f8 and rook takes f6. And I thought if I could achieve the setup and then win back the pawn, then I'll be okay. But what I had missed, and I realized this right after I played f6, is that in this position, white has a really nice move, pawn e4. And this is just completely winning for white now, because if I take the pawn, I get mated. This is just checkmate in the center of the board in the endgame. And I'm pretty sure Magnus like saw this very quickly. And yeah, we got to this position, and I had to take the pawn. Like, this was the only try. But after I take the pawn, then my queenside pawns crumble after takes, takes, and takes. Magnus goes up a pawn, forces a trade of rooks, and after king to f5, he plays king f2, and I'm left with some pretty severe pawn weaknesses and a really passive rook against white's active rook. So I wasn't feeling so hopeful here, but then I had a really cool idea come to mind. And in this position, I thought ahead about 5 or 6 moves, and I saw ahead to a potential stalemate. And the move that I went for is pawn g5, which is a pawn sacrifice. He takes, so now I'm down 2 pawns, but then I play d4. And I'm trying to get as many pawns off the board as possible to try and maximize drawing chances. And the line I had calculated back when I played g5 was if he plays rook b6, going after this pawn, I would defend. And then king f3 looks very natural to prepare not only a pawn check or a pawn fork, but a pawn checkmate, given that my king is completely cut off by the rook. So if this happened, I would play g4 check, force the king back, take the pawn, king takes, and then I would play rook to d3 check and say, oh no, my rook. And then he would be confused and he would take it. And then it would be stalemate. And I would be a national hero. And there'd be articles all over the world. I'd go on the front page of Reddit. But this didn't happen, unfortunately. And even if this position did happen, white is still completely winning after king f2. So my dream and my fantasies were not at all a reality. And yeah, after I played g5, he did take. And after d4, he didn't play rook b6, but he played rook to h5. And all my dreams of stalemate kind of just went out the window because now the king is not cut off. And yeah, it's hard to orchestrate a stalemate trick in this position. So I went in with the king. He takes, I take, he takes, and I take. And I still had some small ounce of hope. Like, even though I'm down 2 pawns, white has 3 pawns ready to storm down the board. I have 1 pawn also ready to storm down the board. And this is essentially a race scenario where if I can queen before him, then maybe there's some chances not to lose. But unfortunately, after rook e5, king to d4, he plays g4. And these pawns are really, really quick. And my rook is kind of tied down to my b pawn. So I decided here to play king to c3 to try and control the squares my pawn can advance to and also attack his pawn on f4. And in this position, Magnus played a really surprising move. And when he played this move, I thought he just overlooked my threat. But he played g5, allowing me to take the f4 pawn with check. And I went ahead and took it. But after king to g3, we can see the point that white is now attacking the rook and attacking my pawn and ready to queen in just 3 more moves. And yeah, hope is running out. The only way to defend my rook and my pawn is to move back. He plays pawn to g6. I played king to d4. He plays rook g5. And I was trying to come up with any sort of last trick, but I realized I'm playing Magnus Carlsen. He's about to queen. So I threw in the towel and resigned, and we shook hands. And as the game was finishing, he was just like signing autographs because there were so many kids around that wanted his signature and photos with him. So it was kind of a funny finish to the game. But yeah, it was a cool experience to play the greatest chess player of all time, arguably. It was different than playing an actual GOAT in chess. Magnus is a really good player, and yeah, in this game he played like Magnus Carlsen. So what to do? But I hope you enjoyed the video, and yeah, and stay tuned for more content. I'm hoping there will be more content opportunities with some top players. So stay tuned, and I'll see you guys soon.